In the suffocating heat of a Georgia summer in 1847, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of unspoken secrets, Margaret Whitmore stood at her plantation house window, watching the cotton fields stretch endlessly toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her single revelation would shatter the carefully constructed world she had built around herself, exposing desires she had buried so deep that even she had forgotten they existed. If you're ready to dive into a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, desire, and the human heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this journey into the darkest corners of the antebellum South will leave you questioning the very nature of love and domination. The morning sun cast long shadows across Whitmore Plantation as Margaret stood in her study, reviewing the quarterly reports. At 34, she had managed the estate alone for 3 years since her husband's death, earning grudging respect from neighboring planters who had initially dismissed her as a grieving widow who would soon sell and return north. Her fingers traced the neat columns of numbers, cotton yields, expenses, profits. Everything appeared orderly, predictable. The plantation ran like clockwork under her supervision, each enslaved person knowing their place, their duties, their boundaries. The mahogany desk beneath her hands had belonged to her husband, Thomas, and before him, his father. 3 generations of Whitmore men had sat behind this desk, making decisions about human lives with the same casual authority they might use to discuss livestock or crop rotation. Margaret had inherited not just the plantation, but the weight of its traditions. The neighboring planters watched her carefully, waiting for signs of weakness, for proof that a woman couldn't maintain the iron discipline they believed necessary to control enslaved people. She had proven them wrong through careful management and unwavering authority, but the cost had been her own isolation. She was neither fully accepted by the planter elite, nor able to form genuine connections with the people she owned. The isolation had grown heavier in recent months. At night, she would walk the halls of the grand house, her footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been filled with her husband's voice, his presence, his certainty about the rightness of their way of life. Thomas had never questioned the system that had made them wealthy. He had been born into it, raised to see it as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. But Margaret had not been born to this life. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a merchant family that disapproved of slavery, but was not above profiting from the cotton trade. When she married Thomas and moved south, she had told herself she was simply adapting to her new circumstances. She had learned to speak the language of plantation management, to think of human beings as assets to be managed rather than souls to be acknowledged. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, not looking up from her ledgers. "Ma'am?" Sarah, her house servant, entered hesitantly. Sarah was a woman of perhaps 40, with graying hair kept neat beneath a white head wrap, and hands that bore the calluses of decades of domestic labor. She had been born on the plantation, had served Thomas's mother before serving Margaret, and possessed a quiet dignity that sometimes made Margaret uncomfortable. Margaret finally raised her eyes. Sarah's usual composure had cracked, revealing something that looked almost like fear. The older woman's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to overhear their conversation. "What is it?" "It's about Elijah, ma'am, the field hand." Margaret knew Elijah well, perhaps too well. He was the strongest worker on the plantation, respected by the other enslaved people, and possessed of an intelligence that sometimes made her uncomfortable. At 28, he stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and eyes that seemed to see through the carefully maintained facades that governed plantation life. She had noticed him from the first day she had taken over management of the plantation, not just for his physical presence, but for the way others deferred to him, sought his counsel, followed his lead even when the overseers weren't watching. There was something about Elijah that set him apart from the other enslaved men. He could read. She had discovered this accidentally when she saw him studying a discarded newspaper, and he possessed a natural authority that made even the white overseers treat him with a grudging respect. He was valuable property, worth perhaps $1,500 on the auction block. But his value went beyond mere economics. He was the unofficial leader of the enslaved community, the man who settled disputes, organized work crews, and somehow maintained morale even under the harsh conditions of plantation life. What about him? Margaret's voice carried a slight edge, though she wasn't sure if it was from annoyance at the interruption or from the strange flutter she felt whenever Elijah's name was mentioned. Sarah wrung her hands, her discomfort evident. "Ma'am, I don't know how to say this proper-like. Just say it, Sarah." "He's got children, ma'am, with all the women, every single one of the women in the quarters." The ledger slipped from Margaret's hands, papers scattering across the polished wood floor like autumn leaves. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "What did you say?" "Elijah, ma'am, he's the father of near every child born in the last 5 years. Ruby's little James, Celia's twin girls, even young Mercy's baby that came last month. They all look like him." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, as if the very foundations of the house had shifted beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white against the dark wood. The implications of Sarah's words crashed over her like a tide, each wave bringing new realizations, new questions, new fears. That's impossible." "No, ma'am, it ain't. I've been watching, listening. The women, they talk. And when you really look at them children—" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They all got his eyes. That same deep brown, that same way of looking at you like they can see right through to your soul." Margaret's mind raced, trying to process what she'd just learned. In the slave quarters, there were perhaps 15 women of childbearing age. If what Sarah was saying was true, if Elijah was indeed the father of most of the children born in recent years, then he had essentially claimed every woman on the plantation as his own. The thought should have filled her with outrage. As the owner of these people, their reproductive lives were supposed to be under her control, managed for the economic benefit of the plantation. Instead, she felt something else entirely, a burning sensation in her stomach that she refused to name, a tightness in her chest that made breathing difficult. The image of Elijah with these women, his hands on their bodies, his whispered words in their ears, his children growing in their bellies, created a response in her that was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither woman wanted to voice. Margaret's mind raced, trying to process what she'd just learned. Elijah, the man she had found herself watching from her window as he worked shirtless in the fields, the man whose presence seemed to command respect, even in chains, the man who had looked at her with those penetrating eyes during their few direct interactions, had essentially claimed every woman on her plantation. "How long have you known?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I suspected for a while, ma'am, but I wasn't sure until last week, when Mercy's baby was born. That child is the spitting image of Elijah, just like all the others. And then I started really looking, really listening to what the women say when they think nobody's paying attention." Sarah paused, seeming to gather courage for what she would say next. "Ma'am, it ain't just that he's the father. It's how they talk about him. Like he's their husband, not just someone who visits them in the night. They speak of him with respect, with love even. And the children, they all know who their daddy is and they're proud of it." Margaret walked to the window, her silk dress rustling in the oppressive quiet. Outside, she could see Elijah directing a group of workers in the cotton field. Even from this distance, his authority was evident in the way the others moved around him, seeking his guidance, following his lead. He moved with a confidence that seemed to transcend his status as property, carrying himself like a man who knew his own worth, regardless of what the law might say about his legal standing. "Why?" she whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. "Why would they all—" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer was more complex than simple attraction or even coercion. In a world where enslaved people had so little control over their own lives, where their bodies belonged to their masters and their futures were uncertain, perhaps Elijah represented something different: strength, protection, a kind of power that existed outside the plantation's official hierarchy. "Ma'am?" Sarah's voice brought her back to the present. What are you going to do?" Margaret continued staring out the window, watching Elijah's powerful form move through the field. A strange sensation was building in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite jealousy, but something that felt dangerously close to both. She thought of the careful records she kept of births and deaths on the plantation, the way she had noted each new child as an addition to her property, without ever considering the human relationships that had created them. "I don't know," she admitted, her breath fogging the glass. "I honestly don't know." The admission felt like a confession of weakness, but it was also strangely liberating. For 3 years, she had maintained the illusion of complete control over her domain. Now, faced with evidence that the most fundamental aspects of her slaves' lives had been organized without her knowledge or consent, she felt the careful structure of her authority beginning to crack. As the day wore on, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on anything else. Every routine task felt meaningless in light of this revelation. She walked through the plantation house like a ghost, her mind consumed by images she couldn't shake. Elijah with Ruby, with Celia, with young Mercy. The thought of his hands on their skin, his whispered words in their ears, his children growing in their bellies, created a burning sensation in her stomach that she refused to name. She found herself returning again and again to her window, watching Elijah work. She noticed things she had never seen before, the way he paused to help a struggling worker, the gentle manner in which he corrected mistakes, the respect with which even the older enslaved men treated him. He was not just a field hand. He was a leader, a protector, a man who had somehow created his own kingdom within the boundaries of her plantation. That evening, as the sun set over the cotton fields, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would confront Elijah directly. She needed to understand, not just what he had done, but why. And perhaps more importantly, she needed to understand why the knowledge of his actions affected her so deeply, why the thought of him with other women created such a storm of emotions within her. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Elijah's secrets, but the hidden desires that Margaret had spent years denying, even to herself. The next morning arrived with the oppressive humidity that made Georgia summers feel like living inside a fever dream. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning with questions and emotions she couldn't untangle. She had lain awake listening to the sounds of the plantation at night, the distant murmur of voices from the slave quarters, the cry of a baby, the soft laughter of women who somehow found joy even in bondage. Each sound had seemed to mock her isolation, her separation from the very human community that sustained her wealth and comfort. She dressed carefully in her most authoritative outfit, a deep blue dress with a high collar that emphasized her position while concealing the rapid pulse at her throat. The dress was one Thomas had particularly admired, and she had worn it to important meetings with neighboring planters, to church services, where her presence reinforced her status in the community. Today, she hoped it would give her the courage she needed for what lay ahead. The morning routine of the plantation continued around her as she made her way toward the fields. The house slaves went about their duties with quiet efficiency, the field hands gathered their tools, and prepared for another day of backbreaking labor under the merciless sun. Everything appeared normal, but Margaret felt as if she was seeing it all through new eyes, aware now of the hidden relationships and loyalties that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. She found Elijah exactly where she expected, in the equipment shed, sharpening tools for the day's work. The morning light streaming through the wooden slats created patterns across his dark skin as he worked with methodical precision. His movements were economical, practiced, the result of years of experience with the implements of agricultural labor. But there was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the repetitive motion of sharpening steel gave him time to think, to plan, to dream. He looked up when her shadow fell across the doorway, and for a moment neither spoke. Margaret felt the full force of his attention, the way his dark eyes seemed to take in everything about her, her carefully arranged hair, her expensive dress, the tension in her posture. She had the unsettling feeling that he could see through all her defenses, past the role she played as plantation mistress to the woman beneath. "Elijah," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Ma'am." He set down the tool and straightened to his full height. Even in the confines of the shed, He seemed to fill the space with his presence. Margaret was acutely aware of his physical power, the way his muscles moved beneath his work shirt, the controlled strength in his hands. She had always known he was a large man, but standing this close to him, she felt almost fragile in comparison. "I need to speak with you. About the children." Something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, but perhaps resignation. He had been expecting this conversation, she realized. He had known that, eventually, someone would notice the pattern, would put together the pieces of what had been happening in the slave quarters. "I figured this day would come." "Did you?" Margaret stepped into the shed, closing the door behind her. The action felt both necessary for privacy and dangerous for reasons she didn't want to examine. The shed was small, intimate, filled with the scent of metal and oil and something else, something that was distinctly Elijah. "And what did you think would happen when it did?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see too much. Margaret felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could read the confusion and conflict that she was struggling to hide. She had come here expecting to assert her authority, to demand explanations and impose consequences. Instead, she found herself waiting for his response like a supplicant seeking wisdom from an oracle. "I thought you'd sell me, send me away from here, away from them." The simple statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. The casual way he spoke of being sold, of being torn away from the women he loved and the children he had fathered, reminded her of the brutal reality that underlay their entire relationship. She owned him. She could dispose of him as easily as she might sell a horse or a piece of furniture. The power was absolute, and they both knew it. "Is that what you want?" The question surprised them both. Margaret hadn't intended to ask it, and Elijah clearly hadn't expected it. She saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of hope quickly suppressed. "What I want," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ma'am, when has what I want ever mattered?" "It matters now," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. "I need to understand, Elijah. Help me understand." He leaned against the workbench, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. The gesture was casual, but Margaret sensed the tension beneath it, the careful control he maintained even in this moment of vulnerability. She found herself studying the way the light played across his features, the strong line of his jaw, the intelligence in his dark eyes. Understand what exactly? Why them? Why all of them? The words came out more raw than she intended, revealing an emotion she wasn't ready to name. Elijah's expression softened slightly, and Margaret saw something that looked almost like pity in his eyes. "You think I forced them? You think I used my position somehow?" "I don't know what to think." "Then let me tell you something, Mrs. Whitmore. In this place where we got nothing, no freedom, no future, no hope most days, sometimes all we got is each other. Those women, they come to me not because I make them, but because I offer them something this plantation can't." "And what's that?" "Choice," he said simply. "I give them choice. I ask them what they want, what they need. I listen when they talk. I hold them when they cry. I make them feel like they matter, like they're more than just property." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her feel suddenly ashamed. When had she last asked any of her slaves what they wanted? When had she last seen them as anything more than assets to be managed, problems to be solved, numbers in her ledger books? And the children? The children are loved. Every single one of them. They got a father who claims them, who teaches them, who protects them as much as I can in this place. His voice grew fierce, passionate, in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. "You want to know why all the women choose me? Because I see them, really see them. Not as slaves, not as objects, but as women with hearts and minds and souls." The shed felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Margaret found herself studying the way the light played across Elijah's features, the intensity in his eyes, the strength evident in every line of his body. She thought of her own loneliness, the empty rooms of the plantation house, the careful distance she maintained from everyone around her. "And what about me?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Elijah went very still. "Ma'am?" Do you see me?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Really see me?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Margaret felt her heart pounding, aware that she had crossed some invisible line, that there would be no taking back what she had just revealed. When Elijah finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I see a woman who's been alone too long. I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be wanted for herself, not just for what she owns or controls." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I see someone who's been watching me from that window, wondering what it would feel like to be chosen instead of obeyed." Margaret's breath caught. The accuracy of his observation was devastating, stripping away all her carefully maintained pretenses. "You're wrong." "Am I?" She wanted to deny it, to maintain the pretense that had governed their relationship until now. But standing there in the intimate confines of the shed, with Elijah's knowing gaze upon her, she found she couldn't lie. The truth was too large, too overwhelming to be contained by the social conventions that usually governed their interactions. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am, it is." "It's forbidden." "Yes, ma'am." "It could destroy everything." "Yes, ma'am, it could." "Then why?" she asked, taking a step closer despite herself. "Why does it feel like the only real thing in my life?" Elijah's expression grew pained, and Margaret saw the conflict in his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her. The space between them seemed to crackle with tension, with possibilities that neither dared to voice. Because sometimes the heart wants what it can't have. Sometimes it wants what would destroy us if we took it. Margaret was close enough now to see the conflict in his eyes, to smell the scent of his skin, to feel the heat radiating from his body. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings, reminded her of the consequences, the impossibility of what she was contemplating. But her heart, her body, her very soul seemed to be pulling her forward, towards something she had never allowed herself to imagine. "What if I don't care about the consequences?" she asked. "You should care. We both should." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. "Those women," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength, "they chose you because you offered them something real, something honest. What if I want the same thing?" "Mrs. Whitmore." "Margaret," she corrected. "My name is Margaret." The use of her first name seemed to break something in both of them. The careful distance they had maintained, the roles they had played, suddenly felt like costumes they were tired of wearing. Margaret saw Elijah's resolve wavering, saw the man beneath the slave, the desire beneath the deference. "Margaret," Elijah said softly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "You don't know what you're asking. Then tell me," she said, reaching out to touch his hand. The contact sent electricity through both of them, a jolt of connection that made the air in the shed seem to shimmer. "Tell me what I'm asking for." Elijah looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers against his dark skin, the physical representation of everything that was forbidden between them. Margaret felt the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers, the warmth of his touch that seemed to spread through her entire body. "You're asking for truth in a world built on lies," he said. "You're asking for love in a place that only knows ownership. You're asking for something that could get us both killed. And if I'm willing to risk it?" Elijah raised his eyes to meet hers, and in them she saw the same longing that had been eating at her for months, the same desperate hunger for connection, for understanding, for something real in a world built on pretense and power. "Then God help us both," he whispered. The moment hung between them, pregnant with possibility and danger. Outside, the plantation continued its daily routine, unaware that in a simple tool shed, two people were about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret felt as if she stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that one more step would send her tumbling into an abyss from which there might be no return. But as she looked into Elijah's eyes, saw the depth of feeling there, the recognition of her own loneliness and longing reflected back at her, she knew that she had already fallen. The only question now was whether she would have the courage to embrace the fall, to reach for something real, even if it destroyed everything else she had built her life upon. 3 days passed in a haze of stolen glances and careful avoidance. Margaret threw herself into plantation business with renewed intensity, as if the familiar routines could somehow restore the order that had been shattered in the tool shed. But every evening found her at her window, watching Elijah move through the quarters, seeing him with new eyes. She observed how the children ran to him when he returned from the fields, their faces lighting up with genuine joy at his presence. She watched him lift little James onto his shoulders, saw him patiently answer the endless questions of Celia's twin girls, noticed the way he gently corrected the older boys when they grew too rough in their play. These were not the interactions of a man who had simply fathered children. These were the actions of someone who truly loved them, who saw them as more than just the inevitable result of physical desire. She also began to notice the women differently. Ruby, who worked in the kitchen, moved with a quiet confidence that Margaret had never recognized before. When Elijah passed by the kitchen window, Ruby's entire demeanor would soften, her movements becoming more graceful, her smile more genuine. Celia, who helped with the laundry, would find excuses to be near the fields when Elijah was working, and Margaret could see the way they communicated without words, a glance, a subtle nod, a smile that spoke of shared intimacy and understanding. Young Mercy, barely 18 and the mother of the newest baby, seemed to glow with a contentment that Margaret envied. She had assumed that Mercy's youth made her vulnerable, that her relationship with Elijah was somehow exploitative. But watching them together during the brief moments when their paths crossed, Margaret saw something different. She saw a young woman who felt protected, cherished, valued in ways that transcended the brutal realities of plantation life. The revelation forced Margaret to confront uncomfortable truths about her own assumptions. She had always told herself that she understood the people she owned, that her benevolent management made their lives bearable. But now she realized how little she actually knew about their inner lives, their relationships, their capacity for love and joy even in the midst of bondage. Margaret also found herself studying the other enslaved men with new attention. There was Samuel, a man in his 40s who had been on the plantation longer than anyone else. There was young Marcus, barely 20, whose strength rivaled Elijah's, but who clearly deferred to the older man's authority. There was old Benjamin, whose wisdom was sought by everyone in the quarters, but who still looked to Elijah for leadership in matters that required action rather than advice. What struck Margaret most was the absence of resentment among the men. In her limited understanding of human nature, she had expected jealousy, competition, anger at Elijah's apparent monopoly on the women's affections. Instead, she saw respect, even gratitude. It was as if Elijah's relationships with the women somehow benefited the entire community, creating a stability and harmony that might not have existed otherwise. The more she observed, the more complex the situation became. This was not simply a case of one man taking advantage of his position or physical appeal. This was something more sophisticated, more nuanced, a carefully constructed social arrangement that served the emotional and practical needs of the entire enslaved community. On the fourth night, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She waited until the plantation had settled into sleep, then slipped out of the main house and made her way to the slave quarters. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the small cabins that housed her human property. The night air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of singing from one of the cabins, a low, mournful melody that spoke of longing and loss. She had never walked through the quarters at night, had never seen this side of plantation life. The cabins were small and crude, but she could see evidence of the humanity that flourished within them despite the harsh conditions. Gardens planted with vegetables and flowers, children's toys carved from wood and scraps of fabric, laundry hung carefully on lines between the buildings. These people had created homes, not just shelters, and the realization made her feel both ashamed and strangely hopeful. She found Elijah sitting on the porch of his cabin, whittling a small wooden toy. The cabin was slightly larger than the others, a privilege that came with his status as an informal leader, but still modest by any standard. He looked up at her approach, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "it's late." "I couldn't sleep." She stood at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly uncertain. The familiar dynamics of their relationship, master and slave, owner and property, seemed inadequate for this moment. May I sit with you?" Elijah gestured to the space beside him on the wooden step. Margaret gathered her nightgown and wrapper around her and sat, acutely aware of the impropriety of her actions. A white woman alone with a male slave in the middle of the night. It was scandalous beyond measure. If anyone discovered them, the consequences would be severe for both of them, but particularly for Elijah. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the wooden figure in his hands. "A horse, for little James, Ruby's boy." Elijah's hands continued their careful work, his fingers moving with surprising delicacy for their size. "He's been asking for one. You're good with children. I love them, all of them." He paused in his carving, his expression growing serious. "Even knowing they'll never be truly free, I love them." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The simple statement carried such weight, such pain and hope intermingled. "Elijah, I've been thinking about what you said, about choice, about seeing people for who they really are. And I want to give you a choice, a real one." Elijah set down his carving and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his features were sharp and beautiful, like something carved from dark stone. "What kind of choice?" Margaret took a shaky breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. "I could free you, give you papers, money to start somewhere else. You could take whoever wants to go with you, the women, the children. You could build a real life away from all this." The offer hung in the night air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elijah was quiet for so long that Margaret began to wonder if she had offended him somehow, if her offer was somehow inadequate or insulting. "That's generous," he finally said. "More generous than I ever expected. But running north with a group of former slaves and mixed-race children, it's dangerous and expensive, and there's no guarantee we'd be safe even if we made it." He picked up the wooden horse again, turning it over in his hands. "The Underground Railroad helps people, but mostly one or two at a time. A group our size would be noticed, hunted, and the children. Some of them are too young to travel hard and fast." Margaret hadn't considered the practical difficulties, the sheer logistics of moving so many people to safety. Her offer had been born of emotion rather than careful planning, a desperate attempt to resolve the moral contradictions that were tearing her apart. "I know the risks, but I also know that what we have here isn't sustainable. This feeling between us, it's only going to grow stronger, and that puts everyone in danger." Elijah reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. The touch was electric, sending warmth up her arm and straight to her heart. "What if I don't want to run?" "What do you mean? What if I want to stay? What if I want to see where this leads, consequences be damned?" Margaret's heart raced. "Elijah, you don't understand what you're saying. If anyone found out about us, they'd hang me and ruin you, I know." His grip on her hand tightened. "But Margaret, I've been a slave my whole life. I've never had anything that was truly mine, not my body, not my time, not my future. But this feeling, what's between us, that's mine. That's real. And I'm not ready to give it up. It's madness. Maybe. But it's also the first time in my life I've felt truly alive." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her own desperate longing reflected back at her. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why this was impossible, all the ways it could end in disaster. But her heart, her soul, the deepest part of her being that had been starved for genuine connection, cried out for something real, something honest, something that acknowledged the truth of what she felt. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we stop pretending this isn't happening. I'm proposing we find a way to be together, even if it has to be in secret. And the other women? Your children? I'll always care for them, always protect them. But Margaret..." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The gesture was tender, reverent, and it sent shivers through her entire body. "What I feel for you is different. It's not about comfort or companionship or even love in the way I've known it before. It's about recognition. It's about finding someone who sees the world the same way you do, who challenges you to be more than you thought possible. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. This is impossible. The whole situation is impossible. Then let's make our own rules, Elijah said softly. Let's create something that's ours, even if the rest of the world can't understand it. How? Trust me, he said, standing and pulling her to her feet. Trust us. Margaret looked up at him, this man who had somehow become the center of her world in the space of a few days. Everything rational told her to walk away, to maintain the boundaries that society demanded. But her heart, her soul, her very essence cried out for something real, something honest, something that acknowledged the truth of what she felt. The night air was warm against her skin, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant murmur of the river that ran along the edge of the plantation. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. Margaret felt as if she stood at the center of the universe, as if this moment contained all of eternity within it. "Show me," she whispered. Elijah's eyes darkened with emotion. Slowly, carefully, he reached up to cup her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away her tears as he studied her features in the moonlight, as if he was memorizing every detail. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Margaret said and meant it. When Elijah kissed her, it was with a tenderness that took her breath away. His lips were soft against hers, his touch reverent, as if he was afraid she might disappear. Margaret melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past months. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more desperate. Margaret felt as if she was drowning and being saved at the same time, as if everything she had ever wanted was finally within her reach. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Come inside," Elijah whispered against her ear. Margaret nodded beyond words. Hand in hand, they entered his small cabin, closing the door on the outside world and all its rules and expectations. What happened next would bind them together in ways that neither fully understood, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, power, and the price of choosing desire over duty. 6 weeks later, Margaret stood once again at her study window, but everything had changed. The woman who had discovered Elijah's secret was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true complexity of desire, power, and love in a world built on oppression. The morning light that streamed through the glass seemed different now, softer somehow, as if the world itself had been transformed by the choices she had made. Her relationship with Elijah had become the center of her existence, the axis around which everything else revolved. They met in secret, sometimes in his cabin after dark, sometimes in the old tobacco barn that was no longer used, once memorably in her own bedroom, when the risk felt like the only thing that could match the intensity of their connection. Each encounter was a revelation, a discovery of depths within herself that she had never known existed. But their affair was more than physical. Elijah challenged her in ways no one ever had, forcing her to confront the contradictions in her life, the moral compromises she had made to maintain her position. Through him, she began to see the plantation through different eyes, not as a business enterprise, but as a system of human bondage that she perpetuated every day. The comfortable rationalizations that had allowed her to sleep at night crumbled under the weight of his questions, his observations, his quiet but persistent challenges to her assumptions. He told her stories of his childhood, of learning to read by watching the plantation owner's children through windows, of the day his mother was sold away when he was 12, of the dreams he had harbored of freedom even when such dreams seemed impossible. In return, Margaret found herself sharing her own secrets, her loneliness in her marriage, her doubts about the system she had inherited, her growing awareness that the wealth and comfort she enjoyed came at a terrible human cost. The other enslaved people had noticed the change in their dynamic, though none spoke of it directly. Margaret found herself making small improvements to their living conditions, better food, warmer clothing, more time for rest. She told herself these were practical decisions, investments in the health and productivity of her workforce, but she knew the truth. She was trying to assuage a guilt that grew stronger every day, trying to find some way to reconcile her love for Elijah with her ownership of him and everyone else on the plantation. The changes were subtle but significant. She stopped using the whip as a form of punishment, relying instead on extra work assignments or reduced rations. She allowed the enslaved people to keep small gardens behind their cabins, to raise chickens for eggs, to gather on Sunday afternoons for music and storytelling. These concessions were noticed and appreciated, but they also created tension with the white overseers who saw them as signs of weakness, of a dangerous softening of discipline. Margaret also found herself studying the faces of the children with new attention, seeing in them not just future laborers, but individuals with their own personalities, their own potential. Little James, with his bright eyes and quick smile, reminded her so much of Elijah that it sometimes took her breath away. The twin girls, Celia's daughters, were developing into beautiful young women who carried themselves with a dignity that transcended their circumstances. Even the newest baby, Mercy's son, seemed to possess an alertness, an intelligence that spoke of his father's influence. The crisis came on a humid Tuesday morning when Margaret's brother-in-law, Charles Whitmore, arrived unexpectedly from Charleston. Charles had never approved of Margaret's management of the plantation, believing that a woman couldn't properly control enslaved people. His visit was ostensibly social, but Margaret knew he was looking for evidence that she was failing in her duties. Charles was a man of rigid principles and unwavering beliefs about the natural order of society. He had inherited his own plantation from his father and ran it with an iron fist, believing that any sign of weakness or sympathy toward enslaved people was a dangerous precedent that could lead to rebellion. He had opposed Margaret's marriage to his brother, considering her northern background a liability, and had been vocal in his criticism of her management style since Thomas's death. "Margaret, my dear," Charles said over breakfast, his pale eyes scanning the dining room with obvious calculation. "The plantation seems to be running well, but I've heard some concerning reports." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart was racing. "What kind of reports?" "Reports about discipline, about your slaves becoming too comfortable, too familiar." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression stern. "A plantation requires firm control, Margaret. These people need to know their place." "They do know their place," Margaret replied carefully, "and they work hard because they're treated fairly." "Fairly?" Charles laughed harshly. "My dear sister-in-law, fairness is not a concept that applies to property. These people are investments, nothing more. And investments require proper management." The conversation continued through the morning, with Charles making increasingly pointed observations about what he saw as Margaret's lax discipline. He criticized the gardens behind the slave cabins, the absence of visible punishment, the way the enslaved people looked him in the eye when he spoke to them, rather than keeping their gaze downcast in proper submission. "You're creating a dangerous precedent," he warned. "When slaves become too comfortable, they start to forget their place. They start to think they're equal to their betters, and that's when rebellions happen." Margaret listened to his criticisms with growing anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew that Charles had the power to cause serious problems for her if he chose to. As Thomas's brother and a respected member of the planter community, his word carried weight. If he decided that she was unfit to manage the plantation, he could petition the courts to have her removed as executor of the estate. That afternoon, Charles insisted on touring the plantation personally. Margaret accompanied him, her stomach churning with anxiety as they approached the fields where Elijah was working. She prayed he would keep his distance, maintain the facade of subservience that had protected them both. But when Charles saw Elijah directing the other workers, saw the respect and attention they paid him, his expression darkened. Margaret watched in horror as her brother-in-law's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Who is that man?" Charles demanded. "Elijah. He's one of our most productive workers. He's too comfortable. Look at how the others defer to him." "That's dangerous, Margaret. A slave who thinks he's a leader is a slave who might start thinking about rebellion." Charles strode toward the group of workers, his intention clear. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized what was about to happen. She had seen Charles discipline slaves on his own plantation, had witnessed the casual brutality with which he maintained order. The thought of him laying hands on Elijah filled her with a rage so pure and fierce that it frightened her. "You," Charles called to Elijah, "come here." Elijah straightened slowly, his eyes finding Margaret's for just a moment before he approached Charles with careful deference. Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, ready for whatever might come. He had been through this before, she realized. He knew how to survive the arbitrary violence of white authority. "Yes, sir?" "I've been watching you," Charles said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "You seem to have forgotten your place." "I don't understand, sir." "Don't you?" Charles pulled out a riding crop, tapping it against his palm. "You act like you're in charge here, like these other slaves should listen to you instead of their betters." Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Charles, Elijah is simply experienced. The others look to him for guidance because he knows the work." "Guidance?" Charles's voice rose. "Slaves don't provide guidance, Margaret. They follow orders. And this one clearly needs to be reminded of that fact." Before Margaret could react, Charles raised the riding crop and brought it down across Elijah's shoulders. The crack of leather against flesh echoed across the field, and Margaret felt the blow as if it had landed on her own body. She saw Elijah's jaw tighten, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't give Charles the satisfaction of seeing his pain. "That's enough," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage. "It's not nearly enough," Charles replied, raising the crop again. "This slave needs to learn respect." "I said that's enough." Margaret grabbed Charles's arm, stopping the blow mid-swing. Charles stared at her in shock, his pale eyes wide with disbelief. "Margaret, what has gotten into you?" "He's my property," Margaret said, the words tasting like poison in her mouth, "and I'll discipline him as I see fit." "Your property?" Charles's eyes narrowed, and Margaret saw suspicion bloom in his expression. "Then why are you protecting him like he's something more?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Margaret felt the weight of every gaze upon her, Charles's suspicious stare, Elijah's carefully neutral expression, the other enslaved people watching from a distance. She knew that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone on the plantation. "Because," Margaret said, making a choice that would change everything, "effective management requires understanding the value of your assets. Elijah is worth more to me healthy and productive than broken and resentful."